All right, sorry about that. I think we're back to normal again. Real important thing about today is it's laid back. Ask questions if you have questions. We're low stress people here. So if it's a problem, just raise your hand. Let's talk about it. I suspect that some of these slides might be a little bit too small to read. So to help you out, I made them smaller on individual handouts. If you like, some people want to see what's going on with these. You're more than welcome to take these. That's perfectly fine. It'll make a little bit more sense in a second once we get to some of this stuff, but this way you at least have an opportunity to look and see what the slides are that we're going to go through. But most important thing is we're going to find out a lot of fun stuff about the thyroid. So this is a little bit about the thyroid here. The thyroid is a very integral part of our body. In fact, it's impossible to separate our thyroid out from anything else that our body does. And so when we have a thyroid problem, and conventional wisdom says, let's just give a medication or a single thing to try and change it, we are missing the forest from the trees. For example, this is just the endocrine or the hormonal communication within the body. You have a part of your brain called your hypothalamus that talks to your pituitary gland, and then your pituitary talks to all kinds of other things, and each of these solid lines is a stimulatory effect, and each of the dotted lines is an inhibitory or calming down effect. And this is only within the hormonal system. If we add the cardiovascular system, the genitourinary system, the musculoskeletal system, it gets like this in a very complex way over and over and over again. So even though our bodies are complex and dynamic beings that were divinely created, our bodies are capable of healing and responding and doing a bunch of really cool stuff with them, but they also present with a bunch of dysfunction whenever they're not working properly. So when we think about the thyroid gland, it's called a cell, right? And you remember this from 8th grade biology. You have this thing that has a DNA nucleus, and it's got this cell wall on the outside, right? Well, in order for a cell to be healthy, you need two things. You need fuel and activation. So if a fuel is not, if the cell is not fed properly, it dies prematurely and doesn't function like it needs to. If that cell is not acted on and used, then it also dies. Kind of like your muscles. If you don't use them, you lose them, right? So within the fuel category, there are 4 essential components that every cell must have. Every cell, from our hair, to our brain, to our toenails, to everything. We must have water, we must have oxygen, we must have thyroid hormone, we must have the capacity to generate ATP or energy. ATP is the biochemical name for cellular energy, kind of like gasoline for your car. You can have an awesome Lamborghini, but if it's on empty, the Ford Escort beats you in a race, right? So if we don't have ATP capacity, we can no longer activate and do our job. If we don't have thyroid activation, or thyroid delivery, we can't activate and do our job. If we don't have oxygen delivery, like if we're anemic or we have a red blood cell issue, then we have another issue with the cell. And if we don't have hydration, same thing happens. So therefore, when we think about thyroid health, it would be inadequate of us to say, oh, I'm only losing my hair and my blood levels are off, therefore I have a thyroid problem. We can literally have thyroid problems that affect every cell of the body, and we often overlook that in conventional medicine. So for most of us, we will get a lot of bang for our buck if we ensure that thyroid hormone activity is working like it should. Because in the Venn diagram of health, if someone has low thyroid function, they're going to have very similar symptoms as someone who has low oxygenation. And they're going to have very similar symptoms as someone who has poor ATP creation or mitochondrial dysfunction. And very similar symptoms as someone who gets chronic dehydration. It's really hard to separate out those symptoms and call them just thyroid or just blood sugar or just oxygen related stuff because they're so integral to cellular health as a whole. Okay? Were you raising your hand a second ago or were you? Okay. Wasn't sure if you were trying to flag me down. So with that being said, since we now understand the concept that thyroid function applies to all bodily systems, what systems will thyroid potentially interact with? All of them, just like we talked about, right? So therefore, when we look at thyroid interactions, there's going to be liver complications, blood sugar complications, brain complications, GI, etc. We cannot isolate the thyroid from these things. So let's just think about traditional medicine, which is phenomenal in a lot of cases, but grossly inadequate in others, right? The top 40 prescribed medications in the United States, and I know this is small on the board and it's small in your notes, trust me. But the top 40 I put in bold with symptoms that somehow interact with the thyroid gland. And of the top 40, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that don't have some direct or indirect association with thyroid metabolism. That does not mean that every time someone has high blood pressure, they have a thyroid condition. But as we know, thyroid must control cardiovascular activity. If that thyroid system is imbalanced, it's plausible that the cardiovascular system is compensating somewhere for that inefficient connection. When we look at the way that depression or anxiety occurs in individuals, and we come back to how is the cell of the brain being fed its fuel or fed this system of thyroid hormone, if thyroid is imbalanced, anxiety and depression are more likely to present. When we come over here and look at type 2 diabetes, there's like 7 different medications that show up here for type 2 diabetes. If thyroid is not delivered appropriately to the cell and the body is compensating elsewhere by causing sugar cravings and addictions to adapt for cellular fuel because it's lacking somewhere else, then it's likely to contribute to blood sugar and glucose mismanagement issues. So therefore, it is impossible to escape the effects of thyroid imbalance, and some medications are inappropriately attempting to manage a thyroid imbalance. We see it a lot in the office. When we start getting thyroid stuff going better, the need for some of these pharmacological interventions for thyroid stuff, blood pressure stuff, cholesterol stuff, depression and mood stuff starts going down because adequate fuel delivery is allowed getting to the cell where it's supposed to be. So, in conventional medicine, the American Thyroid Association says that thyroid issues are a big deal. These are conventionally diagnosed by the primary care physician or an endocrinologist thyroid-related condition. 12% of the population is going to have a thyroid condition at some point in their lifetime. Now, this is conventional pathologic imbalance, not functional imbalance of associated issues. This is true on thyroid dysfunction, where it's lab diagnosed and treated through pharmacological interventions. 12% of the people that we know are probably going to have thyroid-related issues. About 20 million Americans have some level of thyroid disease at this time, whether it's autoimmune thyroid, hypothyroidism, hyperthyroidism, something's going on with the way their cells are being fed thyroid hormone. And about 60% of those with thyroid disease don't even know it happens. Imagine 60% of the people of the 20 million running around not even realizing that their symptoms are a result of inefficient thyroid delivery. Unfortunately, women are more likely to have thyroid problems than men at the rate of about 5 to 8 times more. Additionally, women are also more likely to have autoimmune related stuff, and as autoimmunity is frequently seen with thyroid related things as well, they go hand in hand. So, how does the thyroid work then? In an attempt to not overwhelm you with basic physiology, I say basic, that's a silly word to say that. Entry-level physiology for medical students and beyond. I'm trying to put some basic physiology here. So we talked earlier about the hypothalamus driving the pituitary, which in turn the pituitary talks to the thyroid. This is called the HPT axis. We have one that goes from hypothalamus to pituitary to the adrenals. We have one that goes hypothalamus, pituitary, gonads. We have things like this to try and stimulate hormone balance. As thyroid hormone is created, as the pituitary tells the thyroid to make thyroid hormone, the thyroid itself then starts generating T3 or T4, which are the fuel-based delivery systems, or calcitonin, which helps regulate calcium metabolism, parathyroid activity, and is seen in like thyroid cancers to start doing weird things. Most of us are concerned about T3 specifically, or T4 and how it becomes T3, because that's how we receive fuel to our cells. When thyroid hormone is imbalanced, symptoms start rolling in. So we're going to use our whiteboard again because it's easier to follow along when we draw it out as a whole. So for example, I'm not a great artist, but this will work out, I think, to help us all be on the same page.
So far, so.
I'm sorry?
So far, so.
So far, so good. Excellent. So for example, and if I were to draw a stick figure of our hormonal system, it might look like this. You got your brain, and your pituitary is in the middle somewhere, right? And then you've got your hypothalamus. So your hypothalamus sends a hormone to your pituitary saying, I need more. The pituitary then sends thyroid stimulating hormone to the thyroid to try and get it to stimulate, to do something, right? The thyroid turns on the factory, and the factory then starts making T4 and T3. T4 is about 94% of thyroid hormone. T3 is about 6% thyroid hormone. The number's a little bit off, but it's somewhere in that range. But the important part here is T4 is inactive, which means out of the gate, it's not ready to work and make your cell have the fuel it needs to do something. It needs to go to a body part, usually places like the liver, that's where it does most of the work, goes to a place like the liver, and then the liver converts it into T3. Independent of where T3 is generated, it then gets on a transport system, terrible truck, but there you go, there's T3. That's a bassinet, it looks like. And that bassinet of T3 delivers down to the cell, and at the cell, it does DNA replication, so it helps rebuild and regrow our tissues, and ATP, or energy creation, right? And on its most simplistic level, this is what we need to happen every time your body says, I'm low in thyroid, let's make some more, okay? In this process, there are a couple of places where we have some loose ends though. So for example, your liver, in addition to making T3, will generate about 20% of thyroid conversion into something called reverse T3. And this is inactive, inefficient waste product that comes as a result of this. It'll also generate some other metabolites that are very rarely tested because only research labs test them. But most of the hormone we create goes into active T3 so that we can do something with it. So therefore, if our goal is to end up with T3 at the cell, there are ways we can evaluate the body for optimal function, which sometimes are evaluated and many times are not. But this is essentially what we're trying to accomplish, okay? So, if I was looking for someone that had thyroid dysfunction of some kind, we now recognize that there could be dysfunction from hypothalamus talking to pituitary. There could be dysfunction from pituitary talking to thyroid. There could be dysfunction of factory generation, conversion, transportation, or delivery. And what's not on this board here through normal optimal physiological processes is secret number 7, where the immune system creates an antibody to where you have an autoimmune expression of thyroid dysfunction. So for some individuals, their inability to get thyroid hormone to their cell is less an endocrine-based condition and more of an autoimmune-related issue as their body attacks their thyroid. Kind of like someone who has multiple sclerosis or lupus or whatever other autoimmune condition we might think of. When the immune system is attacking something, we get symptoms down a certain area, but it's an immune-related concern that we want to try and address. So these are the 7 major areas of dysfunction that someone could present with as they have a thyroid condition. So now how do we know what's working and what's not? If we stay in this chart here, many of you may have heard of a test called thyroid stimulating hormone, or the TSH test. This test is routinely run by medical doctors as a screening tool to see how the thyroid is doing. So let's just imagine you have a teenage daughter. We'll pretend she's 16 years old. And you ask her to clean her room, okay? We'll call you the pituitary and your daughter the thyroid. And the next day you show up and the room's not clean. Does your voice escalate or diminish? Escalates. So when TSH starts going up, it's because your teenage daughter isn't doing her job. Does that make sense? We typically call that hypothyroidism. She's slow in doing her work. I know you all have great daughters and that would never happen in your world, but hypothetically speaking, right? Now, on the other hand, you're still this parent and you ask your daughter to clean her room, and a week goes by and 2 weeks go by and you just see that her room's clean all the time. How's your voice going now? Are you even asking her to clean her room if you see it's already clean, right? So when your TSH goes down, it's assumed you have hyperthyroidism because it's working too fast on its own, so the need for stimulation has changed. Okay? In reality, the TSH number isn't as directly tied to the thyroid as we think it could be, but it's a frequently tested blood lab because it gives us a reflexive assessment of what's going on. You can have hypothyroidism and low TSH in some scenarios, just like you can have hyperthyroidism. That's a little bit harder to do, actually. You probably won't have hyperthyroidism with high TSH. But you can have some weird things going on, and that's because there's 6, 7 different ways in which the thyroid gland can create with dysfunction. So, very easy thing to do if any of you have blood work or anything that you brought, or you pull it up on your lab portal real fast, and you see your TSH is high, you might say, oh, that's why they told me I need this medication, or that I was told I have hypothyroidism or something like that. It's because of this process. Any questions with this so far? If we have questions, please don't let me just keep droning on. Ask me stuff. I don't mind, okay? So now that we see this idea, let's back up a little bit and go back to our slides here. So what does it look like in real life? We just saw what it looked like in real life. That's generally how we think of thyroid physiology and the basic assessment in which we use the TSH as our starting number. So let's see what your medical doctor or functional healthcare provider, somebody is thinking when you walk in and you have a list of symptoms. Remember, we filled out this paper of common symptoms related to thyroid dysfunction, and you walk into your doctor and say, hey doc, I've got fatigue, I am constipated, my skin's dry, my hair's falling out, I'm more depressed and lonely than I think I should be, I think I have a thyroid problem. This doctor instantly generates a category of symptoms and says you might have a diagnosis of thyroid. Therefore, let's pretend you're a non-pregnant adult who is symptomatic. Okay? And because of that, we're now going to go through a flow chart in which we figure out what you might have condition-wise, and we start with this test called thyroid stimulating hormone. And this flow chart tells us exactly what to do next. If it's low, you might have hyperthyroidism. Go make sure it's not some autoimmune condition, and there's a whole separate flow chart that kind of lets us go through that. The next one is, if your thyroid or TSH is high, you might have hypothyroidism. You might want to run some extra testing here. So we might want to look at that T4 number, since that's where most of it comes from. Is the T4 high also, or is it low? It kind of lets you scroll through that pathway to see what's working and what's not. Or if you have all those symptoms and it's in range, we can assume thyroid is fine. And this is straight off of Quest's website for trying to figure out thyroid-related imbalance with someone who's symptomatic and not pregnant. Right? Because sometimes pregnancy jacks up some things. But it's the flow chart. So let's pretend now, we'll go to this person real fast. I got to backtrack, sorry. I can tell you which we're testing on this person. So now we got this person here. But before we can look at our blood work, we need to know what some of these labs are. And that's why I printed it out a little bit for you, so you might have some reference ranges to go back and forth to. And I know it's microscopic, but y'all are doing great so far. There are certain tests like thyroid stimulating hormone. We already talked about that. In blood work, there's something called total T4. And what that's looking at is how much of that thyroid factory is able to produce. And it should be much higher than T3, because T3 is the inactive, less produced hormone. And then you got this thing called a free thyroxine index, and it's a calculation to try to determine how much T4 is available. Then you have this thing called T3 uptake that measures the amount of binding sites for T3. So that's super important to try and see if your thyroid is able to pick up that hormone and deliver it where it needs to be and be able to act like it needs to. And then this last one called free thyroxine, or free T4, that's how much available T4 is ready to just work right then. So free T4 and total T4 kind of get confusing sometimes, but you can imagine like all the kids at 7 in the morning got to get to school. some are at bus stops, some are on the bus, and some are delivered in the school already. Total T4 is all the kids that go to that school. Free T4 will be all the ones sitting at the bus stop waiting for the bus to pick them up. Bound T4 will be the ones en route. Delivered T4 will be the ones in class already. Kind of make sense in that idea? So we can think of the bus drivers or bassinets that move hormones around as a way of thinking about how this is negotiating life. So now let's pretend we're this individual. This person here was 34 years old. She's female. Her hair's fallen out in patches. She can't lose weight. She has low energy, low sex drive, and she reports that she's depressed and anxious. So what are we thinking? You got to have a thyroid problem, right? Because we just saw all these questionnaires that say people that have those symptoms probably are thyroid-related people. We saw our flow chart a second ago that says if we think those people are symptomatic, we should start with a TSH test. So this person had a thyroid panel run on them, and their TSH came back at 1.42. For the non-doctors in the room, when it's in this range here and not flagged high or low next to it, it's considered normal. So this person with raging symptoms comes in, and a blood test is performed, and the doctor says, "Yeah, everything's good. Let's see you in 6 months and see how it goes." How frustrating is that, right? That's so frustrating. So this woman in her mid-30s feels like everything's wrong, but yet is told she's absolutely normal. Now, to be fair, we mentioned at the very beginning that thyroid symptoms mimic anemia symptoms. They mimic blood sugar or energy creation symptoms. They mimic dehydration symptoms. So it's very plausible that this person really has no thyroid stuff at all. But on the other hand, it's also plausible that when we take this chart here and look at how we ran TSH only and total T4, we missed potential conversion issues, transport issues or delivery issues, because we don't technically have enough information about her to make a thyroid decision, even though her TSH is technically normal and her total T4 is technically normal. Okay? So we can look at these ideas and say, well, wait, what if we had a little bit more information? When we come back to these functional ranges versus laboratory ranges, there's a little bit of nuance there that can help give us a little bit more insight. Is it okay if I erase this? Everybody's kind of got this idea okay? All right. This is a pretty ghetto easel, but it seems to get the job done. So let's talk about this idea on this portion of the chart that talks about functional ranges versus traditional ranges. All right, so when we have symptoms, we're pretending we're this lady, we're mid-30s, we've got all these symptoms, the doctor says you might have a thyroid problem, therefore let's run some labs to confirm it, and now all the labs came back normal. Conventional medicine and conventional lab testing takes symptomatic people, places them on a chart, and through the concept of standard deviations, a bell curve is created and a standard deviation is removed. That standard deviation is about 2.5% off either side, leading us to believe that 95% of the people that get their labs tested fall within normal ranges. Okay? Unfortunately, the sampling size that we use for labs often involve hospitals, cancer treatments, symptomatic people, etc. We get some wellness people in there thrown in the mix as well, but unfortunately the data gets skewed based off of ranges that are larger than they need to be. In Houston with LabCorp, the reference range is 0.45 to 4.5, which means if someone walks in and has a 15 TSH, we can all look at them and say, that's probably an issue. Matches the symptoms, matches the diagnosis, matches the blood work, check the box, they have hypothyroidism. On the other hand, if they walk in at 4.1 and have all the exact same stuff, we look at them and say, not bad enough, we'll see you in 6 months. We'll see you in a year. Drink some water, get some good sleep. Maybe you need an antipsychotic medication. Maybe we can give you a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor or something, right? So therefore, when we look at this process, the concept of functional medicine says, what if we take people that have no symptoms, plot them on a chart, create a standard bell curve as well, use our standard deviations? Is it possible that our reference range of the healthiest 95% of the people is a better goal to shoot for? And so now we create 3 different categories of people. We have our optimal range of people that have no symptoms, and that's where the majority of them lie. We have a functional range where maybe if someone falls in this category, it's worth looking at their diet, looking at their medications, modifying something with herbs or supplements, doing something to support them in their need. And then we've got this range way out here that everybody knows is a problem. Right? So from a functional medicine approach, on that little chart that you have, you'll see traditional labs, and then you'll see functional labs right under it, which is typically a more narrowed range, because that's where asymptomatic people tend to fall. So, we'll go back to this individual that we're looking at. The good news with her is her thyroid really was fine. We ran more labs and the rest of her thyroid was fine. She was a raging anemic person. So her iron levels were just abysmally low. She couldn't generate oxygen delivery to her cells, and she was getting a lot of the same symptoms as someone with thyroid issues, but it was because of anemia, not because of thyroid stuff. So let's look at this person here. And I know this is sometimes kind of hard to see. It's hard getting blood work zoomed in enough to where you can get context. But this person has a thyroid stimulating hormone test, and it is less than 0.005. We saw earlier that the normal reference range from LabCorp is 0.45 to 4.0, and theirs is less than 0.005. Additionally, we see her free T4 is 6, flagged red and high. Her free T3 is 2.29, flagged red and high. You may want to take a wild stab in the dark of what's going on with this particular person. Thyroid running too fast or too slow? Too fast. Her thyroid is going 100 miles an hour and not stopping to go. It's just nonstop. She's over-creating hormones. So she came in with a little bit of a different type of thyroid presentation. Her heartbeat's beating nonstop, heart palpitations. She's agitated and jittery. Her eyes are literally like bugging out of her face, like she's losing the fat pads behind her eyes, and it's causing her eyes to separate out. She's unexpectedly losing weight, you know. She's having all the symptoms you don't want because her thyroid metabolism is just burning through everything she can possibly do. Interesting presentation. We don't often think about that when we think of thyroid stuff, but this person's thyroid was in the wrong direction. She had something called Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune thyroid thing where it forces the thyroid to go too quickly. But now we can see someone whose labs were kind of in a pretty good range at 1.42 versus someone who's now at 0.005 or less than 0.005. Very different presentation. Now let's come to this person here. And this, once again, is hard, but this is the most classic presentation of someone who comes into my office. This is a female. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different TSH tests and nothing else. I know, I was trying to make it as small as possible just for you. No, I'm just joking. It's one of these things where, like, how do I show how inappropriately managed this person's condition was prior to coming to our office? But from 2013 to 2020, we've got 7 different thyroid TSH tests only. This person's body temperature is not regulating properly, so she's always cold, she's losing her hair, she's overweight, she's tired, she's constipated. Like, she has every thyroid symptom you can possibly think of. And they keep running her thyroid tests, and they're just normal over and over and over again. Then a wild hair happens every once in a while where they run T4 and they go, yep, everything's still normal. When we ran her complete panel, she was not producing T3 and converting T3 at all. So even though she looked fine, other compensatory tests were showing up as not converting, not delivering thyroid hormones. So on the surface, she had adequate levels in her blood, but functionally, she couldn't do the things she needed to do. Modified her diet a little bit, supported her thyroid function, helped her liver to convert and conjugate those hormones a little bit more efficiently, lost a bunch of weight, energy comes up, the basic temperature that she had increased like a degree and a half, so she came up to normal body temperature again. Feels like $1 million, unless you're now when like her neck bothers her. So How do we get to something like that? Well, we got to look beyond just the TSH and the T4 test. So I wrote on here some extra tests that we want to look for. And in a second, I'm going to read you all our thyroid stuff again. And we're going to go through some, in fact, let's just do that right now. Why wait, right? Am I going too fast? No. Am I going too slow? No? Doing okay? All right. So let's go back to just a second where we were a minute ago. It's going to be less legible. Draw a real truck this time. All right, there we go. So when we have these things like thyroid stimulating hormone, there's more to the story besides just what's being stimulated. There's more to the story than just the total amount of T4 or the total amount of T3, because you have free available T3, free available T4. You have reverse T3 that tells us how efficient our conversion is. We have our T3 uptake that tells us how transportation and delivery is going to be here. We have other parts of the puzzle we can start looking at to know how the real thyroid function is working, because we already said there's 7 potential ways in which the thyroid starts shutting down, 6 of which are normal endocrine or hormonal issues, with the 7th being the immune system that's attacking the thyroid. So in this scenario, when we look at this next slide where it talks about free T3, total T3, reverse T3, it gives us the picture to know how someone can present. And so I'm going to have a couple of cases here for you, and some now female hormone stuff, because she's 16 years old and having female related stuff, right? So in this scenario, her estrogenic imbalance looked like it was going on. We upped the thyroid support, her to hear a little bit about how thyroid testing is done, why more thyroid tests might be necessary than the basic TSH and total T4 number. We've seen that there are certain symptoms that can happen for people with thyroids that are too fast, while other symptoms might happen when they're too slow. We know sometimes the immune system is involved. How do we take all this information as normal lay people and go home and try and support ourselves a little bit better, right? Well, let's think about it. First and foremost, we do a little bit of self-evaluation. I passed out a questionnaire today just so you have a chance to evaluate yourself and say, what does it look like in my life? If we're having a slew of thyroid-related symptoms, maybe it's a thyroid thing, but maybe it's an anemia thing, maybe it's a blood sugar thing, maybe it's an oxygen delivery thing, something. Let's evaluate our lives. There are some other questionnaires we could do to try and help that out. Next, have you had labs? I see you brought some labs, it looks like, so we'll use you as a case study in just a second if you don't mind. But we can look at labs and kind of say like, well shoot, have I had the testing necessary to rule in or rule out a thyroid problem? And if I have I had adequate testing to figure out which aspect of thyroid dysfunction is actually going on in my life? Or is it the basic TSH that tells us something, but it potentially misses the boat for some other things, right? Out of that, have we ruled out other potential factors? Does our lab work rule out anemia or menopause or blood sugar imbalance or diabetes or whatever it might be, right? Is there something else going on that's making me think I have a thyroid problem that I want to put all the blame there, but yet it's really, I just eat Whataburger every day and that's what my problem is because I don't sleep and I eat junk food, right? Have you started making modifications in your own life yet? Are you modifying what you eat? There are certain foods that make things worse. So for example, that person here that has these raging antibodies, we've done extensive testing on her to try and figure out which foods make things better, which things make her worse, etc. And this person, I do not think you could pay her $1,000 to eat a piece of gluten. I don't think so. And she's 16 years old because she knows what gluten will do to her. It'll freaking jack her up and she hates it. So she will, if we go out to eat in a restaurant with this person, she'll say like, nope, and will not eat while everybody else just sits there and eats. Because she doesn't want to risk it, right? She doesn't do eggs either. Imagine in your life being gluten-free and egg-free, but when you do it, your symptoms are livable. And when you eat gluten or eggs, you turn back into this person. Things shut down, hair falls out, gut falls off. Sleep all day, right? So certain foods can make things worse. Very common ones if we have autoimmune conditions, like if you have Hashimoto's or Graves or some other autoimmune thyroiditis, something like gluten probably should be off the list for a while. Until you can prove that gluten is fine in your life, that's the most common inflammatory trigger for someone that has autoimmune thyroid things. Dairy, corn, soy, nightshades, which are like tomatoes and eggplants and bell peppers and stuff like that, those all make the list in different amounts for different people. And sometimes we can use blood type to try and figure out which one is most likely to happen or which one's not. But there are certain foods that if we have an autoimmune related trigger, that food is more likely to make it worse as well. Next, are you doing things in your normal life that might be supportive to your body? In addition to diet and identifying the problem, are you taking a supplement or an herb that helps thyroid function? If you've got thyroid imbalance and you take a supplement that helps with that, is it really doing its job or is it not, right? One of the things that I caution most people about, lay people about, is this process right here. Let's imagine you have a regular blood test and your TSH is elevated. We'll say it's greater than 5. So it's lab elevated, not functionally elevated. Peer-reviewed medical research says that if you have hypothyroidism, there's a 90% chance that you have Hashimoto's. Autoimmune thyroiditis of the thyroid, 90% of the time for individuals that have lab high TSH numbers. Autoimmune thyroiditis, we saw in one of the previous slides, will be an antibody toward the TPO enzyme. The thyroid peroxidase enzyme works in our little factory called the thyroid, and its job is to assign iodine to the thyroid molecule. T4 is called T4 because there are 4 iodine put on it from the TPO enzyme in the thyroid. T3 is called T3 because 3 iodine are put on it by the TPO enzyme. Iodine is heavily associated with TPO. And iodine is the most commonly added ingredient for a thyroid supplement that we just buy off the market. But now watch what happens. If we have hypothyroidism, and I go and get a thyroid supplement, and that thyroid supplement has iodine in it, but I do not know if I have a thyroid peroxidase enzyme antibody, and I put more iodine into my life, I cause the factory to work more, and I cause my immune system to activate more and more as well. Sometimes self-supplementing is a dangerous game to play. And not because it's a bad product, but because that product was not designed for someone with autoimmunity in mind. Now, if you do not have an antibody to that enzyme, having iodine in your life can be super important for getting thyroid production to kick in and work like it needs to, because now you have the enzymes and the raw nutrients to create the hormones you need. This is one of the main reasons I strongly encourage people to get comprehensive testing, not TSH and T4 only. And if you've ever been diagnosed with hypothyroidism, knowing if you have antibodies that are present is a big, big thing, because it potentially affects how you will handle iodine in your future. But if you don't have those antibodies, iodine is one of the greatest things you can take in your life to make it work better. But unfortunately, without the lab, we don't know. So symptoms can help when we do those questionnaires. They can help us identify, is the thyroid system involved somehow? They unfortunately cannot tell us, is it an autoimmune related issue? Or is it a binding site issue? Or a conversion issue? And the labs fill out that picture for us. So when we look at how we might support the body through normal, natural ways, one of the best things you could do would be to lower carbohydrate intake, raise protein intake, in order to try and generate some metabolic stability with blood sugar. When metabolic stability happens, your cells can start making and using ATP or energy a smidge more efficiently, even if thyroid hormone is dysfunctional. Additionally, we can look for ways to try and get selenium and magnesium into the diet. things like Brazil nuts, organ meats, things like that can be super supportive for non-iodine based support. Eating a whole food, non-processed diet can be huge, and potentially avoiding inflammatory foods like gluten or dairy or corn or soy or nightshades or eggs or whatever it is that you know you react to, right? If you're like, oh, he said go eat Brazil nuts and those cause me anaphylaxis shock, but I want more selenium in my life, please don't do that, right? So if you know things like tree nuts kill you, we have to figure out how to get you, nourished in a different way, right? So before we have a potential case study, any thoughts or questions about anything you want me to try and answer for you specifically?
So what type of tests, when you go to your regular doctor?
Yeah. When I go to my regular doctor,
Do you have a list of?
it would essentially be all of these. So a total thyroid panel that I like to run on people is this test. I ran this one, for example. So I look for these tests. So it's going to be TSH, T4, T3 uptake, free thyroxine index, T3, free T4, reverse T3, TPO, and TGA.
So basically, I'll give him this list. I said, I want this.
That's what I would do. That's what I have my patients do. I'm like, hey, you're going to go get your primary doctor to use your own insurance and do these labs. It's more cost effective if you do that. Please ask for these tests, and I'll give them a requisition and say these are the ones I'm looking for a comprehensive thyroid thing. Now, to be fair, some run it and they don't even care. They're like, yeah, sure, that sounds great. We'll do it.
Yeah.
And some say, no, I'm not doing that. I'll run a TSH with reflex. And what that means is they'll run a TSH, and if it's out of range, the lab on its own will automatically run a free T4. And if that free T4 is out of range, then it'll run a T3 test. And it just kind of cascades based off of lab reference ranges and if they're out of range or not. Unfortunately, as we've seen today, TSH is not the end-all be-all of tests, and a lot of people slip through the cracks and don't get full thyroid assessments because of that particular test. Sometimes they'll run a thyroid panel, which is better than nothing, and that'll include a TSH, a total T4, a T3 uptake, and a free thyroxine index. So it'll be these first 4 tests. And there's a lot of information you can glean from that, but they're indirect measurements. They're not specific, accurate assessments. Because in this scenario, and this is why I put this one up, if we only ran a thyroid panel, we'd think she's doing awesome. But because we ran the total numbers, we can identify that we were over-supplementing her with thyroid glandulars, and we needed to back that down a little bit, because even though these other numbers looked fine, her T3 numbers were saying, why do I need to produce T3? You're just going to eat it later. And she was relying too heavily on the support we were giving her.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Now, to be fair, you don't technically have to run the antibodies all the time. My panel is kind of like a Sam's Club panel or a Costco panel, and the more I bundle together, the cheaper it becomes. And so technically, if I take out these tests, it's more expensive than if I add them. And it's just a weird thing that the lab does with my office because of how we bundle things together. So I have antibody tests that happen every time, but not everybody really needs that, because if we know it's autoimmune and we see the trend coming down, I probably don't have to include that every single time. Great question. Any other thoughts or questions? All right.
I can't wait for you to look at my numbers.
Let's look at them real fast, and we'll do it together as a class. Is that okay if I grab this from you?
Yeah.
Perfect. And we're going to slide our little chart over here and try and make it legible and see if we can come up with an answer. I'm sorry, say that again? Oh, okay. All right. So I probably draw this up 20 times a day for what it's worth. So we do this really quickly. But we're going to start from scratch. So we got our brain. We got our pituitary. We got our hypothalamus. We got our thyroid gland. It makes T4 and T3. T4 comes to the liver. It converts into T3. Independent of where this comes from, it gets on a truck, delivered at the cell. All right? We hopefully will have reverse T3 here. We have a total T4, a free T4, a total T3, and a free T3. And then we got our T3 uptake. So the good news is we have some extra labs, and we have a long history of labs as well. So we're going to jump right to the newest ones, which were from 7, 26, 24. So they're pretty recent. And if we come down here and see our TSH number, we've got TSH is 1.55. Our T4 number is not measured, unfortunately. So we got a free T4, which is 1.29. And those are the only two thyroid tests we have from the new one. So this is a common thing, right? This is a thyroid reflex or a minor thyroid panel. So we're just going to kind of fill in some extra numbers as we go back down the list. So we're going to go back one to November of 23 because we've got some more tests here. And it's pretty close. So that one was 1.56. And then this one was 1.3. So we're really close already. That's why we're going to use these numbers. We've got our total T3, which is 81. Well, that was really poorly written. We've got a TPO antibody. That's exciting. That one is 208. And then we've got the thyroglobulin antibody of 3.5. We'd have to go back 3 years for T3 uptake, so we're going to skip that one, unfortunately. And we'd have to go back 3.5 years for the free thyroxine index. We have some other tests from way back in 2021 that rule out the Graves' disease antibodies. So these two antibodies are present, but the Graves' disease one is not there. And okay, this is an ancillary test. It's not anything we've talked about so far. Her total cholesterol is elevated at 204, which isn't crazy, but a long time ago, before we created statin medications, cholesterol was an indirect measurement of thyroid function. So when we see cholesterol a little bit high, because it was 204, and before that it's 217, then 232, and 208, but if we go way back to 2019, it's 190 or less. It even goes down back to 2010 to where it was 151. So if we were thinking genetic predisposition, we'd see greater than 200 for 10 years straight, right? Because if it was really a gene thing or a heredity thing, it wouldn't creep up over a 10-year period, okay? So a cholesterol test is an indirect test for the thyroid. And without going too crazy down all the rest of these, looking at her anemia markers don't look like they're out of whack at all, so she looks like she has good oxygen delivery. Her immune cells look like they're looking pretty good. And her basic electrolyte function looks pretty awesome as well, so good. Lots of really, really good things in the other parts of the test from metabolically speaking. But of what we can see here, we've got a TSH test that's technically normal. So we would say no thyroid issue. Do you have thyroid symptoms like fatigue or hair loss or constipation or difficulty losing weight or kids that don't listen or anything like that?
Fatigue, but other than that,
okay.
I'm good.
Okay, perfect, which is awesome. So we're not having a ton of thyroid symptoms, which is great. Mm-hmm. The thyroid numbers, I generally like them to be between 1 and 2. And so it falls right where I want that to be, so that's a good sign. The free T4, oops, let's see here. I know y'all can't see this. But if you go to the first one where it says summary of thyroid labs with ranges, that's going to be our little chart there with our cheat sheet. So when we see the free T4 number, it's going to be in the bottom right corner over here. You can see that. It says our functional range is 1.0 to 1.5, which also looks pretty close like we want it to be, right? That's a great one. We don't have reverse T3. I'd like to see this one from a conversion standpoint. She doesn't have a ton of symptoms though, so that's a good sign. This one though is a great test to know how the liver is doing. Her liver enzymes are normal, which is great, but I want to know how it's functioning. So it just means she's not having cirrhosis of the liver or fatty liver going on, at least from her labs. But when the reverse T3 is greater than 20, I start thinking estrogen issues or blood sugar issues or exposure to heavy metals and chemicals, something like that. So I like having that test to let me know about other parts of the body that could be gumming up the system. We don't have that on her, and she's not having a bunch of symptoms, so that's a great sign. T3 uptake is that loose indication of how are we using it. We don't have any of those right now. We don't have our total T4 number or our free T3 numbers, but we do have total T3, so we can scoot forward a little bit to our next slide that talks about the additional thyroid labs with ranges. And if you look at the second one down, it'll say our total number is, oh, that's not going to work on yours. If every time we eat gluten, our fatigue seems to express itself a little bit more, is it because we're generating an inflammatory response, which is acting like diminished thyroid function? Or if we already avoid these things, is it something else that we're missing? There's a lab I sometimes use called Cyrex. Cyrex does something called a gluten cross-reactivity screen. The reason autoimmunity is a big deal for thyroid people, with gluten specifically, is because it acts like celiac disease of the thyroid. So celiac disease is a condition in which every time you eat gluten, your immune system eats your intestines. Some researchers claim that Hashimoto's is celiac of the thyroid, and that we should, upon receiving TPO antibodies, never eat gluten again and treat ourselves like celiac disease. So this lab says, what if your immune system that's already confused and attacking you and is treating gluten like it's you, what if it's treating dairy like it's gluten? What if it's treating egg like it's gluten? That's the test we ran on that other girl I was talking about and why she doesn't do gluten or eggs. It's because we were trying to rule out cross reactions from the immune system because her thyroid was just being bombarded. So we ran a test to see, does your body treat egg like celiac disease, even though egg is gluten-free? And her body said, yes, I do. Please stop eating me, right? So in some scenarios, I run an additional test to look and dig down this rabbit hole to see why someone might have thyroid symptoms, even though from what we see so far, it's looking pretty good.
So I did give up gluten, dairy, soy, mostly corn, except I have some tortilla chips.
Right.
I do eat eggs. And
I'm not saying eggs are your problem necessarily.
Right.
Right.
But,
But those are good starting points, right? Like avoiding that. Now, it could be that it has nothing to do with that. It could be your makeup. It could be like your shampoo. There can be all kinds of weird stuff that we react to that causes the immune system to think that weird thing we react to is your thyroid. And that's the screwy thing with autoimmunity is it can technically be triggered by all kinds of stuff. Chemicals, metals, other hormones, foods. It can do all kinds of weird stuff. I'm sorry, yes, ma'am?
no, go ahead.
I was going to say the best thing you've got going for you so far is a lot of symptoms are doing pretty good. And it sounds like you're pretty functional even though you've got these immune things going on in the background.
Yeah, my endocrinologist said that I would always have that Hashimoto's marker, but
Right.
for now my thyroid is working.
Right. Yes, because these numbers, TSH look good and T4 look good. It's justification to claim that it's going well.
Yeah.
You're not on any medication right now? That's perfect. Yeah, that's huge. So it seems to be doing pretty good then. That's awesome. You were going to ask a question. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to ask you about the eggs. Is it the whole egg or is it just the whites?
It depends on the person, is what she said. From an immunological response, our immune system reacts against proteins. So it's going to be more the protein portion of the egg that triggers this cross-reactive thing. But technically, anything that triggers an immune response could do it. Most of the time, this cross-reactivity happens through the protein section of it, though. That's why it's gluten and casein and dairy, not lactose, for example, the milk sugar. So I would lean toward the white part, but it's too difficult to separate the protein out of the yolk portion, even though that's generally the fatty part. If there's some level of albumin, which is the egg protein inside there that you're reacting to, even though you're trying to separate it out, it could still potentially trigger that reflex. Yes, ma'am. Any other questions? Thoughts? Was this too overwhelming? No? Followed along more or less okay?
So based on my numbers, should I have the iodine or not?
Based off your numbers, should you have the iodine? I cautiously err against giving people iodine when they have TPO antibodies above 50.
Okay.
And then when it's below 50 and I slowly give them iodine-y things, I recheck it after about 3 months to see if I broke them and made them go worse. So because yours is over 50, I'd be more cautious of supplementing or adding fortifying things in your life with iodine. But if you went and had egg, which is going to have iodine in it, and you're non-reactive to eggs, I wouldn't stress very much about it.
Okay.
Or if you had salmon and there's some iodine in salmon, I'm not going to stress too much about it because it's natural occurring, full food thing. But if you're having, bleached white flour fortified with iodine, I would be really nervous about that because that synthetically derived chemical derivative of iodine is more likely to trigger this effect than something that's naturally just in normal life. It seems to be that way clinically, at least. I don't know if I could peer review, justify that, but it seems to be that people that react more to packaged things that are fortified rather than whole food-based things that have naturally occurring iodine in it. Cool. Any other thoughts or questions? I don't even know what time it is, but I feel like we've been going for a while. 8:10. We've exceeded our hour. So thank you very much for coming. We'll conclude today. Thanks for coming. Hopefully you all got something out of it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email, send me a text, let me know what's going on, okay?
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Y'all have a good night. And I'll give this back to you so you can have it here.
Thank you.
Is that still doing live?
Yes.
Perfect.